My name is Nathan Cole. I worked remote communications and relay sites for just under 12 years, most of that in mountain weather and winter states, and one season on the North Slope where the cold made every metal surface feel alive. I know what normal danger sounds like. I know the pop of ice letting go on a cross brace. I know the long singing note a guy wire makes when the wind changes direction in the dark. I know the difference between a generator cough, a fuel line shudder, and a loose latch tapping itself to death at 30 below. What happened at Site 41 was not any of those things. The tower stood on a ridge north of Coldfoot, just far enough off the Dalton that truck noise never reached it clean. 312 feet of red and white steel, guyed in 3 directions, with obstruction lights at the crown, an older microwave dish under the upper sections, weather instruments mounted off the southeast face, and enough patched-together radio equipment in the shack below to make it still useful, long after it should have been retired. I was hired to winter there alone, log system health, keep heat and fuel stable, report icing, and make sure the site stayed online through the worst part of the season. That was the official version. The real reason they kept a man on that ridge after midnight was to have someone awake when the climbing started. I know how that sounds. If I heard somebody else tell it, I'd assume isolation had gotten to him, or that he'd seen one bad thing on a tower and built the rest around it, because fear likes a story. Maybe that would be easier. The truth is less generous. Too many people before me heard the same sounds, wrote the same times down, and learned the same rules the expensive way. By the time I understood what those rules were for, I had already stayed too long. I took the contract for money. There wasn't any grander reason than that. My younger brother died the previous spring in a wreck outside Spokane, and what he left behind wasn't much, except 2 boys, a half-finished house, and debts nobody knew about until creditors started calling. His wife was working doubles. I was wiring what I could from job to job. Northline Communications offered winter pay that was better than anything else I could get that fast, plus hazard differential and completion bonus. If I finished the full term, there'd be enough to keep the mortgage current until summer. So I flew to Fairbanks, signed a stack of paperwork, sat through 6 hours of cold weather safety training, and got handed off to a site lead named Asa Lund. Asa was the kind of man winter changes without ever quite breaking. Broad-shouldered, quiet, deliberate, with a face that looked as if it had spent years turned into blowing ice. He drove me north from Fairbanks in a company truck, stopped twice for fuel and once for coffee, and didn't make conversation unless it had a use. By the time we reached Coldfoot, daylight was already thinning. We slept there for a few hours, then took a tracked utility rig up to the ridge after first light. Site 41 sat behind chain-link fencing half buried in drifted snow. There was a squat operations shack on concrete footings, a generator shed, a raised diesel tank, a plowed path between structures, and the tower itself, lifting clean into a white sky that made it look taller than it really was. In daylight, it was just infrastructure. Ugly, expensive, necessary, steel planted in bad ground to carry voices over distance. At night, I learned, it looked like something else entirely. Inside, the shack was small, but better than some places I'd stayed. 2 desks, equipment racks, battery alcove, single bunk, hot plate, chemical toilet behind a curtain, metal shelves with canned food and bottled water. The place smelled like heater dust, old wiring insulation, wet canvas, and diesel heat. The front window faced the tower at an angle. The roof hatch ladder was bolted in the rear corner beside the battery bank. Every object in that room had one purpose, and knew it. Asa spent the day walking me through routine. Hourly comm checks with dispatch after 1800. Fuel levels at 6 and 6. De-icing relay test when wind allowed. Visual inspection of anchors and lower guy wires at first light. Log any interruption to obstruction light timing. Never pull rack power before switching panel B. Don't run both space heaters and the microwave backup on generator load If the outside temperature dropped below 40 under. If the weather package locked, cycle it from the wall breaker, not the rack. The work all made sense. It was ordinary site work, made harder by cold and distance. The kind of job where discipline matters more than strength and boredom kills more people than drama. That afternoon I shoveled drift away from the generator shed, checked the lower ladder guard on the tower, and called in a clean first report to dispatch. Asa watched me work without hovering. Once or twice I caught him looking past me at the tower with an expression I couldn't read, but I figured he was just checking my pace. He was getting ready to leave when he handed me a small spiral notebook from the desk drawer. It was weatherproof, grease-stained at the edges, the kind of field notebook everyone in that line of work carries. "This is for nights," he said. I looked at the notebook, then at him. "There's a night checklist in the site binder. Use this one." He said it with the same tone he'd used to tell me not to overdraw the generator. No drama, no smile. I opened it. The first page had a single line written in block pencil. "Read before first night alone. Follow exactly. Do not improve on it." The next page held 7 numbered rules. Different handwriting, different pressure. Like the list had been added to over time, by people who hadn't trusted each other with much, except necessity. If you hear climbing on the tower after 000 and no maintenance is scheduled, stay inside. Do not go out with a light. If the sound stops below the first service ring, do not let it know you heard it. Do not answer any voice that comes through on Channel 3 after midnight. If the top beacon goes dark between 1:10 and 1:14 a.m., switch off the desk radio and stay below the window until the light comes back. If you see anyone above the 4th red section, do not shine the spotlight on the face. If frost forms on the inside of the window, cover the glass and do not open the door for any voice. If it reaches the dish, cut main power and do not restore it until daylight. I read the page twice. "What is this?" I asked. "Nights," Asa said. "That's not an answer. It's enough of one." I looked back at the list. Who wrote these? Men who wanted to finish the season. I asked him if this was some kind of sight joke. He didn't laugh. He took a black marker from the desk, circled the wall clock and said, "If anything happens that you can't explain, write the time first." That bothered me more than the rules. A joke needs a reaction. A superstition needs an audience. But Asa wasn't performing anything. He was trying to leave me with instructions without naming the reason for them. That takes a certain kind of fear. "There've been 4 winter watchers up here in 6 years, he said. 1 quit, 2 finished. 1 left before the road opened and never came back for his last pay. Follow the rules, and you'll collect yours." He should have said more. I should have demanded more. Instead, because the site looked normal, and the work was normal, and men in remote jobs pass around folklore the way old sailors did, I convinced myself that this was another version of the same thing. Don't whistle in the generator room. Don't say a dead climber's name on open channel. Don't watch the aurora too long when you're tired. Stories grow in isolation. Asa left just before noon. By dusk, Site 41 belonged to me. People who haven't done that kind of work think isolation means empty time. It doesn't. The hours fill themselves. Snow has to be cleared from vents. Fuel has to be checked twice because one bad reading at 40 below can become an obituary by morning. Logs have to be clean because mistakes in warm rooms become frozen repairs outside. I cooked a simple dinner, made my first night check, and settled into the rhythm of the place. The tower had a constant voice of its own. The steel settling, wind through the lattice, occasional soft reports of ice cracking off cross members and striking lower braces on the way down. Once you listened long enough, all of it fit together into a pattern. The site became a machine you could hear without looking at. The first 3 nights were uneventful, not quiet. There is no real quiet in a winter station, but uneventful. No channel anomalies, no light failures, no unexplained knocks on the tower. I slept in short blocks after dawn, made coffee too strong, watched the sky go from iron gray to brief white and back again, and began to believe the notebook was an overgrown safety ritual. On the fourth night, at 12:47 a.m., I heard someone climbing the tower. There is no mistaking that sound if you've spent enough time on steel. Ice falling makes one kind of report. Wind-driven vibration makes another. A man climbing gives you rhythm, weight, grip, center of gravity shifting from one rung to the next. Up, set, pull. Up, set, pull. I was filling out the hourly log when it started. 3 quick contacts, a pause, 2 slower ones, then a scrape long enough to make me stop writing. I looked at the clock first because Asa had told me to. Then I looked at the notebook. Rule 1. If you hear climbing on the tower after 000 and no maintenance is scheduled, stay inside. Do not go out with a light. The sound came again. Higher this time. Not fast, not tired either. Whoever or whatever was out there moved with patience, like it understood exactly how much time the night contained. I stood up without meaning to and took 2 steps toward the window. The next sequence killed my last sensible explanation. It was too even, too deliberate, rung to rung, rung to rung. Something was moving on the tower. No truck had come up the ridge, no engine noise, no headlamps below, no radio call from dispatch, no scheduled maintenance in my binder. The climbing continued for another 20 minutes. I know because I wrote down the time every few minutes, partly out of obedience and partly because writing gave my hands somewhere to go. 12:52, 12:56, 1:01, 1:05. At 1:09 the climbing stopped. Not high up, close. I knew the tower dimensions from the site diagrams and from my daytime walk-around. There was a low service ring beneath the first major platform, just high enough that, from the right angle, it lined up with the upper slope of the shack roof. That was where the last sound had come from, below the ring. I looked down at Rule 2. If the sound stops below the first service ring, do not let it know you heard it. That line had sounded ridiculous in daylight. In the dark, with the heater fan cycling down and the whole shack suddenly too still, it made immediate animal sense. I stayed where I was. Then I heard breathing outside the wall, not imagined breathing, not wind through a seam, wet, heavy breaths, close enough that if I had been standing at the window, I think I would have felt the condensation through the glass. There was a faint rattle in it, as if one lung worked slower than the other. I kept my eyes on the desk, because I did not want to look toward the window and find a face where no face should be. The breathing moved along the outer wall toward the door. I heard a soft friction there too, like soaked cloth dragging over corrugated metal. Then the sound stopped at the step. One careful contact touched the metal tread outside the door. I had a flashlight in the drawer, a flare pistol in the emergency cabinet, and a sidearm buried in my duffel, because remote sites allowed them for wildlife. None of that mattered. Every object in the room had become practical in the wrong way. The notebook was the only thing that felt useful, and it was just paper with bad handwriting. The breathing returned to the tower side wall. I heard a slow rubbing pass there, then nothing for so long I thought maybe it had gone. Then, without warning, the climbing started again. Fast this time. The impacts ran up the steel in a hard ascending sequence until they blurred into the tower's own voice and vanished. I stayed in the chair until first light. Outside, the wind had polished the snow hard around the base. My own boot prints from the previous afternoon still showed in the crust, half filled with drift. There were no other tracks leading from the fence to the tower. Nothing had approached from the ground. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was the lowest rung of the ladder. There was blood on it. Dark iron brown, frozen into the metal where a gloved hand would have closed. Under the smear, lodged in a rough patch of ice, was a thin gray strip that looked like fabric until I touched it and felt the softness beneath the frost. Skin. I stepped back and nearly went down when my boot slid on something slick beside the concrete pad. 2 more droplets had frozen there. Blood again, but no prints. No trail, no drag marks, no sign of a man who had bled and then left. Only the tower. I called dispatch and asked whether anyone had been routed to Site 41 overnight without notice. The man on shift, Darnell, said no, and asked if I wanted a trespass concern noted. I said yes. He sounded irritated, not alarmed. I did not tell him about the blood. That afternoon, I searched the desk more carefully and found previous winter logs bundled in a lower drawer. Most were routine entries: voltage drift, fuel readings, light inspections. But 2 winters back, in January, I found a note from a watcher named Kenny Dobbs. 1:16. Heard climbing again. Stopped at ring. Sounded like it was waiting. On the next page, pressed so hard the pencil scarred the paper, he had written, "Do not answer CH3. That isn't dispatch." There were no more entries in his hand after that night. I told myself he'd quit. I kept telling myself that until the following night, when Channel 3 spoke to me. The radio setup in the shack was patched old but functional. Dispatch on one band, maintenance on another, weather backup, emergency air to ground. Channel 3 was an older maintenance frequency the company barely used anymore. Since my arrival, it had carried only static. At 12:31 a.m., while I was pouring coffee, the dead speaker clicked, and a man's voice said, very clearly, "Watcher, how many rungs tonight?" I stopped with the pot in my hand. The voice sounded close and flat, like it had been squeezed through too much weather. Adult male, calm, not frightened, almost conversational. I set the coffee down and stared at the radio. Silence. Then the same voice again, rougher. "Watcher, how many rungs left?" I wish I could say I remembered the rule in time. I didn't. Reflex is stronger than caution when you've spent years answering field radios. I picked up the mic and said, "Say again, Channel 3. The response was immediate. A burst of static hit so loud it made me jerk the handset from my ear. Under the static, I heard what might have been a laugh if it hadn't broken halfway into a choking wet sound. Then the speaker began clicking in a pattern, not random interference. Counted clicks. Click, 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 click. At the same moment, outside, steel rang under sudden weight. The climbing had started again, but not from the height I'd heard the night before. It was lower, almost level with the shack roofline, as if answering the radio had skipped part of the descent and brought it straight to me. I killed the desk lamp and dropped below the window. The counting on Channel 3 continued. Between the clicks, I heard a whisper of numbers too faint to make out. The voice wasn't just asking anymore, it was measuring something. Then, a shape crossed the edge of the glass. Even crouched low, I caught it in the pulse of the lower red beacon. A body climbing the outer face of the tower, turned inward toward the steel, one arm reaching too high, then another, parka hood hanging back. The next pulse showed the boots. They were pointed the wrong way, toes down, heels up, as if the legs had been twisted around beneath the knee and were still working. The figure climbed through the angle of the window and kept moving upward. I remembered Rule 5 without needing to read it. Do not shine the spotlight on the face. I had no intention of going near the spotlight now. Something on that tower was using the shape of a man without being arranged like one. The main dispatch channel crackled. Site 41. Confirm accidental key, Darnell said. I answered without standing. Accidental transmit. A pause. Then, "You alone up there, Nate?" The question sat wrong with me. Yes. Another pause. Stay off Channel 3 after midnight. Not what happened. Not who called. Just that. Before I could ask why, the climbing stopped again. Higher than before, but still lower than the previous night's highest point. The counting ended with it. After that, there was only the tower hum and the sound of my own breath. At dawn, I found a strip of orange winter shell fabric snagged on the catwalk just below the microwave dish. visible through binoculars from the fence line. Same color as the company Cold Weather Parka's North line issued in Fairbanks. Later, in Kenny Dobbs's packet under the desk, I found an employment sheet listing him as having left early due to a family emergency. No completion signature, no forwarding address, no last pay acknowledgement. In the inside margin of his final log page, almost hidden against the spine, he had written, "It asks different voices once you answer. Don't let it learn yours." That was the first day I seriously considered leaving, not because of the tower itself, because of the company. Superstition is one thing. A hidden notebook is another, but old logs, missing pages, a dead radio channel that somebody in dispatch already knew to avoid, and a former watcher whose paperwork ended in a lie, that meant knowledge. Not full understanding, maybe, but enough knowledge to keep a man on the ridge and call it routine. I phoned Asa on the satellite contact sheet that afternoon. "What is Channel 3? I asked when he picked up. A long silence. Then, "You answered it." "Yes." "Did you use your name?" "No." Another silence. "That helps." "I found blood on the ladder." "I know." The calmness in his voice made me angrier than fear would have. "You know, then what am I sitting in?" "You're sitting in a warm shack with fuel in the tank." "That isn't what I asked." "I'll come up tomorrow if weather holds." "Tell me now." "No." "Why not?" "Because if you've only heard it twice, I might still sound crazy enough for you to do something stupid." Then he hung up. He came the next morning with spare filters, powdered soup, and a face that looked 10 years older than it had on the drive north. He checked the generator, checked my logs, looked at the blood on the ladder without saying a word, and sat at the desk with the notebook open between us. I told him exactly what I'd heard on Channel 3. When I got to the part about the boots, he rubbed one hand slowly over his mouth. "What is it?" I asked. "I don't know what it is," he said. "I know when people started treating it as real." He pointed at the tower. "Not this exact steel, the previous tower on the ridge. State relay back then. Weather patch, aviation traffic, emergency carryover. Mid-90s. A medevac out of Bettles lost clean contact in an icing event. Last transmission on record was the pilot asking for elevation and distance corrections because something didn't match his instruments. Search crews found fragments, no complete wreck. After that, men at the old shack started hearing radio traffic that should have died with that aircraft." I said nothing. He continued. "Then one spring, a maintenance climber went up to replace a beacon unit after winter outages. Clear weather, no significant wind. His partner said. He stopped midway and asked who was above him. Asa looked at me. There was no one above him. What happened to him? They found him frozen into the ladder with his fall arrest clipped in. He looked like he'd been trying to flatten himself inside the tower. He let that sit for a few seconds. That's when the first rules started. What about Kenny? As far as I know, nobody recovered him. As far as you know? As far as anyone would tell me. I asked why the company kept the site staffed if they knew any of this. He gave me the kind of answer that only later proves itself to have been honest. Because if nobody's here after midnight, then nobody knows how far down it gets. That night, the top beacon failed at 1:12 a.m. I was already watching the clock. The tower had sounded normal all evening. Wind under 20. Light ice. Clean dispatch checks. I'd eaten, made coffee, checked the heater intake twice, and sat at the desk with the notebook open beside the log. At 1:10, the top beacon flashed on time. At 1:11, it flashed on time. At 1:12, the highest pulse failed. No flicker, no dimming, just absence. Rule 4. If the top beacon goes dark between 1:10 and 1:14 a.m., switch off the desk radio and stay below the window until the light comes back. I reached for the radio switch. Then something knocked on the tower from above. That is the cleanest way I can say it. Not high up on the steel. Above it. A metallic contact heavy enough that I felt the tension shift through the guy wires before I fully heard it. Then another. Then a series of descending impacts, lighter and closer together, as if weight had settled onto the highest steel from the dark above and begun feeling its way down. I should have killed the radio immediately. Instead, I looked out the window. Fear sometimes arrives as correction more than emotion. Your body understands a mistake before your thoughts catch up. That was what happened when I saw movement where empty sky should have been. At first, I thought it was blown snow crossing behind the upper sections. Then the lower beacon pulsed and showed hands. More than one pair, hands moving in sequence along the ladder path above the fourth red section, gloved in different materials and colors, some thick winter shells, some thin leather, one bare enough to show dark split knuckles. They found rungs, released, found them again, smooth and practiced, like multiple climbers sharing one descent without colliding. Under them I saw one hooded head turned inward to the steel, then another, then a third, lower than either should have been. The radio shrieked with static. I slapped it off and dropped to the floor beneath the desk so hard I cracked my knee on the metal pedestal. Even with the speaker dead, a thin, leaking sound went on inside it for another second, as if voices were still trying to get through after the channel had been cut. Then the tower began bringing the climbing down. That's how it felt. Not that something was on it, but that the sounds themselves were descending through the structure in measured stages. Heavy contacts, wet cloth dragging on steel, a zipper tooth catching briefly on a rung. Once, unmistakably, a boot heel striking from the wrong side. The descent stopped above the window. Fingertips moved across the outside glass, not knocking. Feeling. The air in the shack turned colder. I raised my head just enough to see the lower edge of the pane. White fern-like frost was branching across the inside of the glass. Inside, the heater was still running. Warm air still moved through the shack. And yet frost spread inward from the corners on my side of the window. Rule 6. If frost forms on the inside of the window, cover the glass and do not open the door for any voice. I crawled to the bunk, grabbed 2 blankets, and pinned them across the window with a toolbox and 2 cases of bottled water. By the time I finished, the cold coming through the glass was strong enough to feel through the wool. Then someone knocked on the door. 3 ordinary knocks. Not loud, not desperate. The knock of a coworker whose hands are full. I didn't move. Another 3 knocks. Then Asa's voice, plain and irritated. Nate. Fuel line gelled. Open up. He should have been miles away. There had been no engine, no call, no crunch of a tracked rig coming through the drift. Nate, the voice said again. Open the damn door. I stayed where I was, one hand on the sidearm now pulled from my duffel, even though I knew it meant nothing. The voice changed only a little. Nate, I can't feel my hands. The next knocks came lower on the door, then lower still, near the bottom half, irregular and light, moving a few inches sideways between contacts. Not knuckles anymore, fingertips. I pressed one hand over my mouth and listened as the tapping left the door and traveled along the wall, then around the back of the shack in a slow circuit. Once something crossed the roof. Once I heard a wet inhale directly above the hatch. Then, just as suddenly, all of it stopped. At dawn, the frost had melted into long vertical trails on the inside of the pane. In the center left, half obscured by one of those trails, was a hand smear, 4 finger marks clear, and a broken 5th that ended too soon. Embedded in the moisture were tiny black grains that looked like soot until I touched one and felt grease, climbing grease. That afternoon, I called dispatch and requested immediate relief. Darnell said weather restrictions made pickup impossible for at least 48 hours. The sky is clear, I said. Road visibility is poor. Send Asa. Pause. Asa's off schedule. Then send anybody. Another pause. Then he said, keep logging night activity if observed. Operations wants continuity. I had to ask him to repeat that because I thought I'd misheard. Continuity? Yes. Not safety. Not welfare. Continuity. That word explained more than he meant it to. I asked who in operations was reviewing these logs. He said, "Everybody on winter rotation knows enough." That night, I read every old record in the shack. A pattern showed itself. Winter only. Mostly deep, dark periods. Reports clustered around storms, aurora, and sudden pressure drops. The writing in those logs was dry, in the way frightened people try to be dry. Unauthorized voice on maintenance frequency. Lower section impact sequence. Inside frost glass covered. No exterior tracks. There were also gaps. Whole nights ripped clean from binders. Page tears too neat to be accidental. On an older incident form, I found the name Randall Fisk, contract climber, missing during an April maintenance call. Official cause listed as probable weather disorientation or fall. Underneath, in pencil, somebody had added, he was still clipped in when they lost sight of him. Asa came back on my 9th day with an inverter part and an old metal file box. He set the box on the desk and said, "You should see these." Inside were photocopies of pre-acquisition reports from the ridge and a bundle of old photographs. The first showed the original shack and the earlier tower, thicker at the base, older paint pattern. The second showed the lower ladder of that older structure, with something caught in the rungs 20 feet up. At first I thought it was a bundle of gear. Then I understood it was a man. Winter orange parka, safety harness hanging, body folded inward against the ladder as if he had tried to press himself through the steel. "Lauren Vick," Asa said. "Spring crew. The first confirmed dead. You kept these?" "I kept what survived." He sat across from me and rested his big scarred hands on his knees. "You asked what this place is," he said. "Best answer I have is that the tower carries more than signal under the wrong conditions. Voice first, then shape, then behavior. Like it learned how to come farther each year by using the structure. That doesn't explain anything." "No," he said. "It doesn't." He nodded toward the notebook. "Each rule cost somebody." He told me then that the company had shifted to winter watchers after Randall Fisk vanished. Full maintenance crews became daylight only in the cold months. One man alone at night was cheaper, quieter, and, his word, cleaner. "To do what?" I asked, though I already knew. "To mark the depth," he said. "How low it gets, what changes it, whether power stops it, whether radio helps it." I stared at him. "Why stay part of that?" I asked. He looked at the tower for a long time before answering. "Because once you've heard enough of it," he said, "you stop trusting what happens if nobody is here to measure it." That evening, he stayed for dinner and said he'd remain until morning to help swap the inverter after first light. I was relieved and hated myself for being relieved, because his presence meant the rules were real enough that I no longer wanted to test them alone. The tower began just before midnight, not climbing, knocking. 3 heavy strikes from the lower section, spaced far enough apart to feel intentional. Asa and I both looked toward the window. Neither of us stood. Then the knocks became climbing, slow, deliberate. Only the lower section. Then silence. Rule 2. We both stayed still. Breathing moved along the outside wall. The blanket I kept folded nearby was already in my hands. The old Channel 3 speaker clicked once by itself. Then a voice came through so faint I couldn't make out the words. Asa's face changed. "Who is it?" I whispered. He shook his head. The voice came again, louder. I still couldn't understand it, but whatever it said, he did. "My brother," he said. Before I could say anything else, something slammed into the side of the generator shed with enough force to shake snow off the roof. Another impact followed, then the rattle of the shed latch being worked from outside. Asa stood. "Don't," I said immediately. "If it kills the generator, we lose heat. Let it. If the line goes, we lose more than heat." He shrugged into his parka, took a flashlight and a flare canister from the cabinet, and moved to the door. I caught his sleeve. "Asa." He turned, just enough for me to see that he was frightened, not startled, not tense, frightened in a way that looked practiced. "If you hear me ask to come back in," he said, "it isn't me anymore." Then he stepped outside and shut the door behind him. I went to the window despite every rule and every instinct I had left. His flashlight beam cut across the drift between the shack and the generator shed. For a second, it showed only snow. Then it passed over the tower base and found something clinging to the lower ladder. Not one parka, several. Orange and black winter shells layered over each other, sleeves sliding in sequence along the steel, bodies packed too tightly to belong to separate men, and too deliberately to be debris. One hood shifted and a face appeared in the light for half a second. Beard frosted white, lips blackened, mouth open. Then cloth folded over it again. "Asa!" I shouted. He didn't answer. He took one step closer to the tower, like a man in a dream, walking towards somebody he already knows. The sleeves moved, hands, too many, opened and closed along the rung path. The bundled mass rose one rung, then another, not away from Asa, but above him, as though it had simply been waiting for him to stand within reach. Then one arm dropped out of the cluster. It reached lower than an arm should have. The hand touched his shoulder. He jerked once. The flashlight beam spun across snow and steel. Then his body lifted hard against the tower, as if something had taken him by the harness and yanked. One boot kicked free. His flare canister rolled into the drift. For a second he was fully visible in the beam, arms spread, back arched, face turned toward the shack. He looked less terrified than ashamed. Then the bundled shape folded around him, and the tower began taking weight upward, rung by rung, faster each time. I ran to the main power panel. Rule 7. If it reaches the dish, cut main power and do not restore it until daylight. The thing already had Asa in it and was climbing toward the lower catwalk. I yanked the panel open, found the red disconnect handle, and pulled. Everything died. Shack lights, rack lights, heater fan, lower beacon pulse, the low, constant electrical life of the site. Silence hit the room like pressure. Outside, something struck the tower once, hard enough that I felt it through the floor. Then all I could hear was the wind. I waited for Asa to call out. He didn't. I waited for the climbing to continue. It didn't. That should have been the end of it. Survive the dark, wait for daylight, get off the ridge. But power did not stop it. Power only interrupted the path it preferred. At 1:43 I heard steps on the roof. Not scrambling. Walking. Measured weight crossed the metal from the tower side toward the rear hatch. One step at a time, too deliberate for falling ice, too distributed for one man in boots. A soft knock came from the hatch above. Then Asa's voice, patient now. "Open this." I backed into the battery alcove with the lantern and the sidearm and said nothing. The hatch latch gave a testing rattle. "Open this, Nate. It's cold." Part of me still wanted to obey. That is the hardest thing to explain. Not because I believed it was him, because the voice knew exactly how much of him to use. When I didn't answer, the latch went quiet. Then the footsteps crossed back over the roof and were gone. A minute later, with the tower dead and the site hum gone, I heard the climbing restart clearly enough for the first time to understand the direction. Down, not from the lower sections, from above the top steel. The impacts came in long descending runs, pausing at the upper bracing, then resuming. Whatever moved there had not started from the ground and worked its way up. It had been on the tower already, higher than the highest visible point, and the steel was simply the route it took toward the world below. Cold ruins thought. By 2:30 the shack had lost enough heat that my breath showed in the lantern light. The battery bank couldn't carry the heaters long by itself. If I stayed in place until dawn, I might survive, but I might not walk out under my own power. The generator shed had a manual restart path for structure heat that bypassed most of the tower systems. If the lines weren't damaged, I could at least bring warmth back to the shack, without re-energizing the full sight. That meant going outside. I waited until the climbing sounded high again. Then I zipped my parka to the throat, wrapped a scarf over my face, killed the lantern, and opened the door. The cold hit hard enough to take my breath. The sky had cleared. Aurora washed low over the ridge in green veils thin enough to leave the stars showing through. Without the obstruction lights, the tower rose black and unbroken into that light, taller than I had ever seen it in daylight. The generator shed sat 20 yards away. I moved low, keeping my hand light angled at my boots. Snow squeaked under each step, brittle and sharp in the extreme cold. I reached the shed, got inside, and checked the lines. Fuel intact, manual starter alive. The engine coughed, shook, and caught. I routed heat feed back toward the shack only, leaving tower main isolated. Then something crossed the shed roof. A slow, distributed weight moved from the tower side edge to the center. Snow dust sifted down through the seam above the door. Not one set of steps, many nearly synchronized. I should have stayed away from the window. Instead, I looked. Aurora light gave me enough. The lower half of the tower stood empty. The dish sat pale beneath the upper sections. For 1 second, I thought the climbing had stopped entirely. Then motion peeled itself from the darkness above the crown. It wasn't coming up. It was lowering itself down. A cluster of winter gear, parkas, harness webbing, sleeves, boots, hung over the top of the structure and descended in measured stages, using the ladder path like a rope dropped into a well. Hands found rungs. Released. Found them again. Faces appeared only when cloth shifted. A cheek split by frost, a half-seen eye. The outline of a beard rhymed white. Then one hood rolled outward, and I recognized Asa by the reflective stripe on the shoulder panel. He was above the others now, not carried at the bottom, incorporated nearer the top. The whole mass descended to the level of the microwave dish and paused. Every sleeve, every hand, every hanging boot stopped at once. Then, slowly, one hood turned away from the tower, toward the shed, toward me. I jerked back from the window and struck the fuel barrel behind me. Metal rang. Outside, movement began again, but not on the tower. Across the snow, the rhythm was wrong for running, and too regular for a man stumbling blind. Step, drag, step, pull. The same cadence the tower had taught it, transposed onto the ground. I burst from the shed and ran for the shack with the light off and my head down. The sound behind me did not chase so much as converge. I hit the step, shoved through the door, dropped the bar, and backed toward the desk. Something touched the outer wall at shoulder height, then another touch lower down, then several more, distributed around the shack, as if a crowd had come to rest there, leaning their weight into the siding and listening. I stood in the half-warm dark and realized the site had never needed a watcher to prevent anything. It needed a witness. The desk radio was still dead with main power off, but the emergency battery speaker clicked once anyway. Then a voice came through it, ragged with static. Nate, my own voice. The hair on my neck lifted. Nate, it said again, in my tone exactly. Open up. I stared at the dead unit, as the thing outside the wall shifted its weight, and the same voice from the speaker said, almost conversationally, "How many rungs left?" I understood then what Kenny had meant. Once you answered, it learned you a little, enough to keep using you. I did not respond. The touches stayed on the wall. The speaker clicked. Then the radio, dead or not, gave me one more voice, a man I had never heard before, clipped and strained with old interference. Sight, confirm distance. I've got no horizon, not dispatch, not Asa, not Kenny. Older equipment, older fear. The medevac pilot maybe, or something using the outline of him. Then, under that, another voice, younger, panicked. Who is above me? Then another. Please open the door. The speaker went silent. Around the shack, the leaning weight slowly lifted away. I heard the climbing return to the tower, but not far. It stopped low, lower than I had ever heard it stop before, just above the height of the dish. The rule list sat on the desk. I crossed to it and read, Rule 7 again, even though I already knew the words. If it reaches the dish, cut main power and do not restore it until daylight. I had done that, but maybe the dish itself mattered more than the tower feed. Maybe whatever used the structure was anchoring there when the signal path broke. Maybe the old microwave assembly was the real root. There was a maintenance kit in the shack with a cutting torch head and a canister small enough for emergency bracket work. Not much. Barely enough for field cutting, but maybe enough for a waveguide, a mount, or a cable trunk if I got close. That thought should have sounded insane. Instead, it sounded practical, which told me how much the ridge had already rearranged my judgment. The dish was roughly 70 feet up, accessible only by the lower ladder and first platform. In daylight, with proper equipment, it would have been a simple enough climb for someone with my experience. At 3 a.m. in deep winter, with something nested in the tower and moving around it, it was suicidal. But staying put meant waiting to see whether the thing on the wall outside could learn patience faster than daylight arrived. I harnessed up. I still don't know whether that was courage or the final stage of panic. Men in field work are trained to solve problems with the equipment at hand. Give us a leak, we shut a valve. Give us ice, we de-energize, heat, or scrape. Give us a system behaving wrong, we find the failing component. That instinct does not disappear when the problem stops being one a manual can name. It just becomes more dangerous. I clipped into the baseline, opened the shack door, and stepped into air so cold it felt hollow. The tower stood directly ahead, black against the aurora. No movement showed on the lower sections. That should have reassured me. It didn't. I crossed the snow slowly, every sense narrowed to the steel in front of me. At the ladder base, I saw fresh smears dark on the rungs. Blood, newer than the first night. One frozen strand of cloth hung from a bolt beside it, reflective tape catching the aurora. Asa's parka. I put one boot on the first rung. The metal was so cold it bit through the sole. I climbed, 10 feet, 15, 20. My breath thundered in my hood. Every clip, every shift of weight felt too loud. The tower gave off no hum with main power cut, only the dead cold language of steel under load. I reached the lower platform and clipped in. From there I could see the dish assembly above and to my right. Old hardware, icicles along the underside, ice-fattened cables running back toward the feed line. If I could cut the main trunk and damage the mount, the dish would be useless until spring. Then something moved above me. Not fast, not attacking. Hands closed around the ladder 5 rungs overhead. Different gloves, different sizes. One bare, blackened wrist between sleeves. More hands below those. Then a hood lowered into view, facing inward to the steel. I could not see the face. Then another hood above it, and behind that, deeper in the cloth and webbing, a reflective shoulder stripe I knew. Asa. The cluster was not climbing down exactly. It was assembling downward, making itself rung by rung as it came. I remembered Rule 5 too late. Do not shine the spotlight on the face. My headlamp was already on low. When the hood nearest me twitched outward, the beam caught what was inside. Not a face the way I had feared. Worse, several beginnings of faces, as if features surfaced in layers and could not agree on which one belonged there. A cheekbone, half a beard line, the white curve of an eye with no lid, a mouth that opened against folded cloth and showed no teeth. Then the whole thing shifted, and the features slid away from each other, like reflections disturbed on black water. I almost fell backward off the platform. Instead, I tore the torch canister free, sparked it with shaking hands, and drove flame into the cable trunk under the dish. The torch was small. The wind tried to kill it. But metal doesn't care why you're desperate. It only cares how long the heat holds. I kept the flame on the line housing until insulation blackened, and the outer clamp began to sag. Something above me made a sound then. Not a scream, not anger, but a rapid wet breathing from several throats at once. The hands overhead tightened. I shoved the flame into the mount bracket. Bolts glowed. One popped. The dish shifted half an inch, then more. The whole cluster above me lurched. For one awful second, Asa's hood turned fully outward, and I saw enough of him to know he was not alive in any way that mattered. His face was gray-white with frost, eyes open, lips parted, and yet what held him there wasn't death alone. His body moved when the others moved, his hands closed when theirs closed. I kicked away from the mount as the final heated bolt sheared. The dish tore free on one side, swung out, and dropped against the lower braces with a shriek of twisting metal loud enough to fill the ridge. The cluster above me shuddered as if the root through it had been jerked sideways. Hands lost rungs, sleeves flailed. One body or part of one slammed against the ladder hard enough to shower me with ice and something darker. Then the whole mass began withdrawing upward, not climbing with purpose anymore. Recoiling, gathering itself back into the higher dark, taking Asa with it, taking every half-seen face and sleeve and hand, back up the tower, in a rapid retreat that made the steel rattle from top to bottom. I stayed clipped in, pressed flat to the platform, while the last of it vanished above the upper sections. When I finally looked down, the broken dish hung half-detached below me, swaying in the wind. Dawn began as a gray thinning in the east. I made it back to the shack before full light. I don't remember the descent well, only the cold, the shaking in my legs, and the strong, irrational certainty that something was still above me, matching my pace without sound. By the time sunlight touched the ridge, the tower looked like ordinary steel again. Damaged steel now. The dish twisted and hanging. Blood frozen on the lower rungs. A boot half buried in drift, near the pad that I recognized as Osa's by the worn outer edge. No body. Dispatch called at 8:05 from the backup line after I re-energized only the minimal systems. I told them Asa was gone. There was a long silence. Then Darnell said, "Operations will route recovery when possible." Recovery, not search. I told him the dish was destroyed. Another pause. Then, understood. No surprise, no anger, no questions about how or why. By noon, a helicopter came up from the south with 2 men from North Line and 1 trooper who looked like he had already decided what kind of statement he was willing to hear. They photographed the site. They collected the notebook. They took the old file box. One of the North Line men asked me twice whether I had been sleep-deprived. The trooper asked if Asa might have left the ridge on foot in a confused state. I looked at the blood on the tower rung and the twisted dish hanging from the brace and said nothing useful. They logged Asa as missing pending weather complications. They logged the dish failure as structural damage during emergency maintenance. They asked me to sign a temporary incident account. I refused until they changed one line that described the night as a probable cold stress hallucination event. After that, they stopped trying to make me agreeable and started trying to make me tired. I left the ridge before dark. From the helicopter, Site 41 looked small enough to dismiss. A white scar on a slope. Thin steel, hardly anything. That was the worst part. From a distance, the place didn't carry its own weight. It looked like the kind of site hundreds of men pass through every year without a story. North Line paid my completion bonus in full within 10 days. They also wired an additional amount labeled retention adjustment, which is a phrase companies use when they want gratitude without admitting liability. I never saw Asa again. I checked statewide missing notices for months afterward. Nothing under his name, except the same brief bulletin I had already signed. I searched older records too. Kenny Dobbs turned out to have a sister in Oregon who still thought he'd broken contract and disappeared on a binge. Randall Fisk had a closed workers' compensation file and no death certificate. Lauren Vick's old incident notes were harder to find, but one mention survived in an archived local article about tower safety in remote Alaska. The article called his death a tragic weather exposure. That was the official shape of it. Weather, exposure, fatigue, men alone too long in the dark. Maybe that version is easier for everyone. A spring crew eventually took down what remained of the old microwave dish at Site 41. I know because I checked. 2 years later, the company replaced the tower with a shorter modern mast on the same ridge and moved some of the relay load elsewhere. As far as I know, they still keep winter staff rotating through the station during the darkest weeks. Though they don't use the word watcher anymore. I left remote work after that season. Not immediately. Men like me don't walk away from a trade in one dramatic turn. But I took lower elevation jobs, municipal systems, shorter towers. Places with roads close by and other people inside shouting distance. I stopped answering dead channels after midnight. I stopped looking too long at dark steel against winter sky. Every now and then, when weather swings hard and I can't sleep, I think about that ridge and the way the rules were written by different hands. Not folklore, not superstition. Field notes paid for in blood and cold and missing names. People still ask me, when they hear I worked remote towers in Alaska, what the worst part was. They expect me to say the weather, or the isolation, or the time I had to climb in freezing fog with my gloves icing to the ladder. I tell them the worst part was how practical it all became, how quickly the impossible fit itself into routine. A notebook in a drawer, a clock with a circle around it, a dispatcher telling you to keep logging night activity for continuity, a veteran tech who no longer tried to explain because explanation had never helped anyone finish a shift. I used to think the company hired me to watch a tower in case something climbed it from the ground. That isn't what the job was. The tower was only there to give it rungs on the way down.